Mr. Vanderheide, during World War II, you were an Unterscharführer with the 10th Panzer SS Division on the Eastern Front in 1944. Is that correct?
Not quite correct. I was not in the Waffen SS on the Eastern Front, but I ended up as such in the Western Front.
On the Western Front. What was your most memorable experience while you were serving with the Waffen SS on the Western Front? Is there anything that particularly stands out in your combat experience?
It was, of course, the Allied landing in Arnhem and the subsequent fight in the streets of Arnhem, particularly from house to house.
House-to-house combat in Arnhem?
In Arnhem, yeah.
And was that a surprise attack on the Allies? Was that a defensive holding action on your part, or was that offensive, or what?
The Allies decided to, as far as I know, to land in Arnhem because they didn't think that there would be any German troops left in the area. And we were just a remnant. We went at the foot. The complete unit was no longer there. But the rear party of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Division were still in Arnhem. So that we had the occasion to give them a hot reception when they landed in Arnhem.
This was a surprise then? They had no idea that
they had no idea at all that a thing like that would happen right there and then, no.
When you say the remnant of the 10th Panzer Division, what happened to its full strength?
Then I mean to say, by that time, they were moving towards the Eastern Front again. So they had already left the area when this happened.
What was the size of this remnant in troop strength?
Oh, I couldn't say offhand how.
Battalion
yeah,
strength?
About 2 battalion size, but I'm not sure. I couldn't be too sure about it. I couldn't fix me up on that. I couldn't tell you. Maybe 2 battalions.
And so there was savage house-to-house fighting on the part of the SS to hold the town?
That is right. And we had prisoners of war in the basements, Americans, Poles, British. And I remember very clearly that they were very, very scared because they probably thought that the end of their days had come. And now they found themselves in the captivity of the Waffen SS.
And they felt that as a result of being POWs captured by the Waffen SS, that they were going to be mistreated or killed. Is that correct?
It was quite obvious from their attitude.
And what actually happened to those POWs that you had in your care?
Well, in spite of all the confusion that, of course, will occur in such a situation, they were wounded on both sides. We had our wounded fellows, and they were treated exactly the same as our wounded. Our medical orderlies would take care of them, and some of them were under shock, apparently under shock effect. They were given treatment for that, and they were given, and we even shared our last cigarettes with them, and chocolate and whatever we had available. And this was a surprise to the Americans again.
So these POWs were Americans, and what other Allied nationalities did you have?
Poles and Brits.
And they were shocked to be receiving medical care from the SS medics, the same as the SS would give to a German soldier?
Yeah, they obviously had not expected a thing like that.
Why had they had this expectation about the SS that was so negative?
I can only put it down to a lot of vicious propaganda which was being meted out at the time, so that the individual soldier may have been under the impression that he didn't have had no dealings with human beings, but with straight criminals. That's all I can say, because this attitude, to me, to my mind, was absolutely incomprehensible.
And nowadays, in 1985, when the SS is regarded to be a heinous organization which committed all kinds of atrocities, why don't the people, the survivors, the Allied survivors, the Americans, the British, and the Poles, who received this beneficial treatment from the SS, Why don't they come forward in 1985 to refute some of the charges which have been laid against the SS?
That is a very good question, which I can't answer. All I can say that whenever I meet or have met after the war an American or British soldier who had really been in the war, same as I, on the other side, I never had any compunction about mentioning to him when he asked me what outfit I was in, that I was in the Waffen SS, and I was always received with enthusiasm. They were honored even to speak to me. And because they had known us on the other side, and they know these people that have actually been involved in the frontline service are different from those that only heard propaganda on the radio station or whatever. That is quite obvious. But these people had experience, and the bad reputation of the Waffen SS could also stem from the fact that we, of course, were more or less the fire brigade of the German army. Whenever there was something going on, a trick is what we would send us there. See? And our rate of casualties, of course, was highest of all other parts of the German army.
So as a result of you being, would you describe it as a commando force, an elite, a crack troop, so to speak?
I would say so, yes. We were naturally, from the beginning, we were all volunteers. And I must say, although I was not in the Waffen SS right from the start, I had volunteered myself at the age of 17 in 1941, but I wasn't accepted for medical reasons. So I was drafted exactly at the age of 18, if all the rest of my age, I was born in 1924. So I went to an anti-aircraft outfit and spent a few weeks next in France, in northern France, where we had these 88mm guns. And as you know, at the time, this area of northern France was flown over every day by hundreds, even thousands of 4-engine bombers on their way to Germany. And it was our task to, with the anti-88mm, to separate these bullets, to distribute them, so that the fighters would have an easier task. Well, and from there, we were very suddenly and unexpectedly moved to the Eastern Front. And we got as far as Charkov in August 1943.
Where is Chekhov located?
Charkov is one of the major cities in the Ukraine.
In the USSR?
In the USSR, in the Ukraine.
So you were fighting in the Soviet Union in 1943?
That's right. And from then on, this was when I arrived in Charkov. It was the last time that city was reoccupied by the Germans. It had changed the occupants 3 or 4 times before. And from then on, we were more or less on the retreat to the area of Zhytomyr, which is the capital of the Ukraine, and further west, places like Zhytomyr and Berdichev. And towards Christmas in that same year, it was on Christmas Eve exactly, we were overrun by 2 divisions of Russian infantry and artillery and things like that, and thousands of tanks. So we lost all our guns within half an hour. We were all destroyed.
How were they destroyed? By the tanks?
By the tanks, yeah, by the tanks.
What was did you have any relationship with the local people in the Ukraine when you were serving in that area?
Oh, certainly. We used to be quartered in their huts, which were normally thatched roofs, these small farmhouses they had, and they were very kindly to us, and we were kind to them. We had no reason whatsoever to be any animosity against the Russian people, not at all. In fact, when they had a celebration, for instance, I remember on occasion a boy of 21 and his sister, they were twins. They had a 21st birthday celebration, so we were all very happy, and and they were playing the balalaika, and we were dancing and all that sort of thing. It was not at all any animosity with the Russian people, I can say that.
And then, so you were driven back in this counterattack by the Soviet forces, which were these T-34 tanks that were amassed?
Yes, there were the thousands and thousands of them, and the in the previous year, when or at the beginning of the Russian campaign, we had the German army had the normal anti-tank guns, and they had very quickly proved rather inefficient against especially this tank with the number T-34, because it was covered with a thick layer of reinforced concrete. So whenever it was hit by a shell, it didn't do any harm to the tank. It was just a hole the size of a fist in the surface of the concrete, and the tank moved on. So this is the reason why the High Command decided to use these anti-aircraft 88 millimeters against these tanks.
Wasn't that Rommel's idea that he had used that in Africa?
I understand it was Rommel had some experience with these tanks, with these anti-aircraft guns, 88 millimeters in the African campaign. So naturally, it was repeated in Russia also. Now, you asked me about the experiences which have been remained vivid in my memory, and that was shortly after that, in the early January 1944, when we were waiting to be refurnished from with guns from Germany. It would obviously take some time, it would take at least 14 days before the equipment would arrive. So everybody that was not exactly involved with the guns themselves, the gunners, From myself at the time, I was serving as a telephone operator, and others were medical orderlies, and others were maybe typists and things like that. All these people from the whole battalion were called together, and we were ordered to move about 50 kilometers away from there, right in the middle of the forest, where they said was the headquarters of the partisans. And we were about 120 men, 20 of us, and so we moved towards this village. And this little combat unit, as you may call it, was led by the medical officer, strangely enough, the medical officer. So when
Why was a medical officer leading the unit?
Well, he was also one of those officers that were also those personnel. We were not directly involved with the guns, because they had to stay around, because the guns could arrive any day, any hour now. See, that's the reason. So when we closely before coming to that village, the doctor he had to figure out a plan. He said, what I'm doing now, he stopped there and said, I'm going in the village right now with 20 of you, and the rest of us, you will be distributed in 3 circles around this village, and we'll investigate what's going on there, if it is really a headquarters of the partisans and whatever.
The headquarters of what?
Of the partisans of the Russian guerrillas.
Oh, the partisans.
Partisans, see? The Russian guerrilla forces. Okay, and I was happened to be amongst these other people, these 100 of us who were surrounding this village in the woods. And then our order was to remain there until further order. So we waited there for 1 hour, half an hour, 1 hour, maybe 1.5 hours. And then, very shortly, but very clearly, there was the noise of heavy machine gun fire from the direction of that village. And then a dead silence again. So we had ordered to wait, and as good soldiers we did so. We waited for another while, and then a messenger came around and said, and ordered us and gave us messages to go to the village to gather there, and there was some collection in the village. So we went to the village, And there I saw these medical officers and 19 of my comrades. One of them had got away. They were hung up on a tree like pig, their feet upside down, and they were cut from all the way through like a butcher would exhibit his pig in his window, in his shop window. And some of them, they cut their testicles off when they were stuck in their mouths and all that. It was such a dreadful sight that I was sick for weeks after that. I would never really go away from my memory. And this, of course, was nothing surprising. I'm not relating just one single incident. Things like that were happening in Russia, in that part of Europe, practically every day.
These were the irregular forces, the so-called Soviet partisans, who were committing these actions. Is that correct?
I thought so too. But when we rounded up these villages and cleared out the houses, there was not one single male in the area. The male partisans were all out somewhere else, blowing up bridges or whatnot, and this hideous crime was committed exclusively by their women.
By the Soviet women?
By the Soviet women, yeah. So
why did they have this intense hatred? What would motivate them to perform such an atrocity?
Well, I don't know. Again, there must have been quite a bit of propaganda on the Russian side against the Germans, but that was not directed against any particular outfit, against the Germans as such. And maybe, in retrospect, I would say that the whole enterprise was a mistake. It was a bit careless of these medical officers to go right in that village, in this area in the middle of a forest, you know, and that is, and the women just took advantage of the situation. There were only 20 of them, so before they even had a chance to leave the trucks, to leave the lorry, they already fired at them, shot at them with their machine guns. And that's what we heard. That was the machine gun we had heard from the wooden. So if one or two of my comrades were killed right in their truck, they were lucky in a way, you know, and I may say so. But the others were badly wounded and then quickly overcome, and they cut their throats with open jam cans, with open food cans. They cut their throats and all that. And all these bodies, naturally, of course, were medically examined, and it was established that they were still alive when this had happened, and it was not just a show to do with dead bodies.
Some of them were alive when they were having their throats
slit. Some of them were alive when they had their their throats cut with cans, with ripped open tin cans.
And where did this take place?
And that was in the area of Proskurov in the Ukraine. Proskurov, Zhytomyr, Berdichev, around that area, close to what was at that time the Polish border, which is no longer the Polish border. It's now all Russian territory.
Why did some of the Ukrainians in the other village give you such a warm reception, and yet were these women Ukrainian or were these Russian who attacked your comrades?
Well, I don't really know whether there was, as far as I remember, there were two different kinds of guerrillas in that area. They were fighting the Germans for different reasons. There were a number of Ukrainian guerrillas. They also thought they had to fight for their country, but they were certainly not communist. Right?
They weren't fighting for Stalin.
They were fighting for their country.
For nationalism.
All, right? And I never heard any atrocities or something committed by them. Whereas these infiltrated, fanatical communists and Bolshevik, we call them the Red partisans, it was they that did these ugly deeds.
So you would describe these women even as partisans?
Sure, they were partisans. And it is every one of my comrades who have been in the area would confirm that there were whole divisions of female soldiers And when they ever got a hold of the Germans, they would never take a prisoner. They would kill them right away. They were far more brutal than the men, these women battalions.
So when you went into the town and discovered what these women had done, was there some action then taken against the women?
Oh yeah, the place was set on fire. One of these two was burning, and there was a strong wind blowing, and as I said, the houses were thatched, they were covered with roofs, so in no time the whole village was burning. And then these women came out on their knees with a rosary in their hands and were begging for favor. They said, "Pan, pan, 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 Nicorette, Nicorette, Nicorette," with the rosaries in their hands.
Can you translate what they were saying?
Huh?
What were they saying? Pan, pan?
Pan, pan, that is the equivalent for, that means sir, sir, it's equivalent to the English sir. And then they were, in other words, pleading for mercy.
And who set the houses on fire? The SS?
Yeah, yes. Oh no, it was, sure, I think that because these people were hiding, and I must say that my commanding officer, I must add that at this point, he was a lieutenant, Oberleutnant from the Münsterland, and he's in his civilian life, he was a lawyer, and he was a very fair and just man. But when he saw these things, he was so mad, and so that he had to take some action. And that is quite obvious. Any other unit and any other army in the whole world would have done the same thing under the same circumstances.
Well, what action was taken besides burning the village? When the women came out on their knees, then what happened to them?
I don't know what happened to them. I think they were taken away, but whatever happened to them, I'm not sure. I can't say. All I saw, they were taken away.
You were a young man, a teenager at this time, very far away from home, in the middle of the Soviet Union. Did you ever ask yourself at any time during the privations that you experienced and the suffering, what am I doing here? Why am I here? Did you ever question why you had been sent hundreds or thousands of miles from your homeland to engage in this combat?
Oh yes, of course. I was firmly convinced that we were not only fighting for Germany, but for the rest of Europe. And it was unbelievable to us that the Allied wouldn't accept it. And of course it was also very demoralizing when my comrades and friends received letters from home with the information that their houses had been bombed at home, and that places like Dortmund, Hamburg and Dresden were burning, and all these things, That was very demoralizing.
This is civilian sections of large German cities that were bombed and set afire by Allied Air Force planes?
Oh, yes, of course. And not only that, not only that they bombed the civilian quarters, they really singled them out. In the big cities, one quarter after the other, one section after the other, they came back and wiped it out. And when these poor people managed to get out of that inferno to save their lives, and they would come down with their low-diving flying bombers and shoot at every living creature there.
Strafe them with machine gun fire from the planes.
Strafe them with machine guns.
These are British and American...
British and Americans alike, there was no difference at all.
So this was a motivating factor that steeled you in your determination to push on in the Eastern Front, or
yes, because,
did it demoralize you?
Because we felt that the destiny of the whole of Europe was at stake, not only our own country, the destiny of the whole of Europe. And with the experience we had every day, similar to what I just described now, we knew that we had a terrible enemy in front of us, and that if we ever came to be victorious, that would be the end of the whole Western world.
Well, this enemy, I believe you're referring to the Soviet Union, was victorious. Do you feel that it has been the end of the Western world?
Well, that's a good question. I believe that if things had turned out differently, if the Allies would have agreed in 1945 on what to do with Germany, instead of coming to a clash between East and West, things would have been much, perhaps far worse for Germany. You know? Now, as you know, the things moved in quite a different way. The Allies, the negotiations in Yalta and elsewhere came to a deadlock, and so things turned out different as they probably were intended. But and another thing is the reason why it hasn't come to that catastrophe yet is, in my opinion, the existence of the atomic bomb. If it hadn't been for that, I think the whole events after that would have been quite different.
I'd like to get back to that or bring that up later on, but I wanted to ask you, once after this incident with the village occurred where the men were butchered, and you were then pushed back and transferred to the Western Front at this time, or did you still see more action on the Eastern Front?
I saw some more action, and in eastern Poland. And in fact, I was stationed for one while only about, it's less than 10 kilometers away from the place where, as we all know today, this concentration camp of Majdanek was.
Which was a German concentration camp.
Yeah, in Lublin. And all I remember is that I never heard anything. I knew there was a camp in the area, but there were hundreds of Poles running around, civilians. You know, there were some during the day they were working for the German army. They had different kinds of jobs and working for the railroad services and whatnot. You know. And we spoke to them, and they spoke to us, but nobody even mentions anything of what was going on in those camps. So I'm quite surprised, especially of Majdanek, because I was so close there in 1944.
When you say that Polish civilians were moving about, do you mean to imply that these were civilians who had free access to go into the camps and also leave the camps?
I don't know that. I never got really that close to the camp that I was able to work. I couldn't tell you. But what I mean that in those areas, they were free to move, and they certainly had communications somehow with one another. So, and if anything of the sort had been known, there certainly we would have heard of it. I'm quite sure.
And you feel then that, in other words, there was some kind of communication between Poles in the camp, in the concentration camp, and Poles outside of it. Yeah. And as a result of you being stationed nearby, had there been some kind of genocide occurring within it, yeah, that sort of activity would not have been easily disguised, and you would have heard about it conjecturally.
Sure, because I also spoke to some Poles who were actually working in the camp, but who were allowed to somehow to go home again. So they were in the camp. They were working there, doing some also, and I'm quite sure that some of them they had confidence in us. You know, they wouldn't be afraid or something. You know, we were only very small soldiers. You know, and if anything, I'm quite sure they would have mentioned anything like this to us.
There was just, when you say small soldiers, there was just a tiny detachment of
Yeah, no, we were just ordinary soldiers. We were no high-ranking officers. You know?
I see.
That's what I mean, you see. So they would have certainly mentioned something like that. You know?
Were there any other significant battles that occurred while you were in Poland at this time? Any engagements?
Yes, of course. There was in the early days of 1944 was the what we call the kettle of Tarnopol.
The kettle of
of Tarnopol. The city of Tarnopol was completely encircled, surrounded, encircled by the Ruskies, and there was heavy fighting there for a couple of months, you know, in Tarnopol.
Which you participated in?
And and we were liberated at the time by the French volunteers, of the Division Charlemagne. It was they that somehow broke the encirclement and cleared us out there.
You mean to say then that the SS did not consist solely of Germans?
Oh no, oh certainly not. I don't know what the percentage of it was, but quite a high percentage of the members of Waffen SS came from all over Europe.
Why would non-Germans want to join a German organization that wanted to make Germany the leading force in the world?
Well, I don't think that they were thinking in that on those lines. They had the same attitude towards the menace from the east and of the general threat to the Western world
from communism,
from communism and Bolshevism, as we used to call it at the time. So there were Norwegians, Danes, and quite a large percentage, especially from that little country by the name of Netherlands, Holland. There was the largest contingency from there. There were Flemish people and French people, and even a few Englishmen, even English volunteers from Britain.
So this was a pan-European force then?
You can say that. You can say that with every right. You can say that it was all European army, and that is another thing which was a motive for us. We felt that we were a real European army that actually deserves the name of a European army. It is nothing. What we have today, NATO and whatever, is nothing in comparison to what we were. So I really feel that the Waffen SS, we were the first European army that deserved this term.
So these Frenchmen who were part of the SS division Charlemagne were volunteers. They were not forcefully conscripted into
none of them. No. I don't remember any forceful conscriptions in Waffen SS, and that may have been later in the very last months of the war. It's possible that there were conscriptions, but up to that time, the whole European army which by the name of Waffen SS were all volunteers.
And what time was this that we're referring to?
Well, 43, 44, when I was there, and earlier.
So the Charlemagne division broke you out of the encirclement, and how did they manage? How did they do that?
Well, they just figured out where the weakest spot was, and just broke it in with their tanks or whatever, and so there was a breach, and we just went out.
And you went then.
In other words, they saved our lives. I think you can say that.
These French soldiers.
Oh yeah.
And then you retreated to where?
I was staying to Poland, and I said in the area of Lublin for a while. And again there, we were sent for anti-guerrilla warfare. In other words, to clear out these partisan hangouts, and that is a very dangerous enterprise. I rather, from the experience I made there, I would rather be right in the first front line than do a job like that in the back. We're fighting these people because they were hidden from the jungles in the houses, and they were shot you on their back. Next thing you know, and all that, and used to attack us in open streets, from basements and so on. It was a very treacherous kind of a war,
Now, in our time, according to the prevailing information in the West, partisan has become a good word, the idea of partisan. There was a recent movie called Red Dawn where the partisans were saluted and the partisan spirit was saluted. But you seem to feel that the partisans were almost synonymous with terrorists. Is that true?
Yes. I have great respect for... There were some civilian outfits. They were at least recognizable as such. They perhaps didn't have uniforms, but by some means, a helmet or a belt or whatever it was, they were recognizable as soldiers, and it was a fight man to man, and that was understandable and acceptable. But what I do not accept is these treacherous killing of soldiers from the back, from a tree or wherever they were hidden. I'll give you another example. They would, for instance, I mentioned to you before that I was working as a telephone operator. So at times we had to pull these wires across long distances through the woods to make the communication. And at some hidden away place in the middle of the forest, the partisan would cut the line, would cut the wire. So naturally 2 of us or 4 of us had to go and find a trouble spot. And they were just waiting for that. When they came to that spot where the wire had been cut, they jumped out of the bush and killed them, murdered them, slaughtered them. So that is a kind of war which I do not consider a fair war anymore. That is straight murder as far as I'm concerned.
Because the men who had been killed were simply involved in trying to locate this communications equipment?
That's right. And I may also add a few words in this respect to what is often referred and is often spoken about today, the Einsatzgruppen. It was a special elite force which was absolutely necessary to deal with this kind of terrorism.
Am I correct in understanding you to say that it was an allied force?
Oh yes, no, elite force, select force, and they had a special task. It was a special combat force to deal with these partisan activities.
We've been told in the West that this elite group had as its main function the annihilation of Jews on the Eastern Front. Is that so?
No, that is absolutely incorrect. It was, as I said, it was a combat force to fight the partisans and wipe out their hangouts and all. But it may have been so that on the leading side, on the leading officers or commissars, as you call them, there happened to be predominantly Jews, for one reason or other. So if they were killed as such, as partisan guerrillas and not as Jews. It was definitely not intended, or not, it wasn't even planned to use this force in the combat or in the elimination or the extermination or whatever you may say of Jews. Not at all.
So,
but there were quite a number of Jews that they were engaged in this terrorist warfare.
but in other words, then the SS was not going after Jews; they were going after partisans. But they weren't sparing partisans who happened to be Jews. If there were Jews who were bearing arms against the German government, then they would be executed the same as any other Russian partisan.
That's for sure. That's for sure. And the same would happen to any other soldier. If I did the same thing I could have done the same thing in France later on, or if I would go on the other side of the Russian and I would do something, I wouldn't be alive today either, if they got me. That is, it's quite normal, and I think it's also quite legal according to the Hague Convention.
When you make this analogy between yourself and treatment by the Allied forces, you're saying that had you been captured by the Soviets, or if you were acting as a guerrilla or an irregular, the fact that you are a Christian wouldn't have deterred them from shooting you or executing you because you bore arms against them. We're told now that the Soviet Union is anti-Semitic and opposes Israel. So how was it then? It seems rather hard to believe then that at one time Jews held positions of power in the Soviet Union. How do you account for that?
I don't believe in this anti-Semitism on the part of the Soviet Union. I think it's propaganda. I don't really believe in it. Things may have changed a little bit since the last war, that's for sure.
Well, how can you say that when they're arming the Syrians and they're providing the main arms to the Arabs and all these other groups which are very hostile to Israel? Why would they do that if they weren't anti-Semitic?
I don't know. I'm not. I couldn't I couldn't tell you. It's possible that they make a difference between Jews and Zionists. You know? As far as I understand, it's the Zionists that they're after, not the ordinary Jew, not the ordinary Jew.
In other words, that might explain the reason why Yuri Andropov, who has been rumored to have been of Jewish origin and descent, was able to reach a high level of power, the highest level, in fact, in the Soviet Union, but at the same time be at the helm of a policy which was anti-Zionist.
That's right. That's right. That's what I think. Yeah.
But at any rate, you do insist on the fact that many commissars and important leaders in the Soviet Union hierarchy and bureaucracy were in fact Jewish.
That's right. And we also understood and we learned from Russian prisoners of war that they had no other, these poor soldiers, they had no other choice when they had to move against. I must remember, I must put in one incident of in that time, during that time when we were waiting for new guns, we were also sent right into the front line for a while. Well, for 2 weeks I was right in the first, what they call the main combat line.
Where?
In the Ukraine. And so we could practically see the white in the eye of the enemy. It was only about 500 meters away from it. Now, and we had prisoners, and they were interrogated, and they told us that they had no other choice but to go westward and fight us. And when they got strong resistance and they would retreat, they would be shot by their own officers.
I understand that when they would retreat after strong German resistance to them, that often there were NKVD, the right. Secret police in the Soviet Union maintains an army. It's not just plain clothes like the police here.
No, they maintain an army, and if these Russian soldiers were not allowed to be taken prisoners. They were not allowed. They either had to die for the Soviet Union, but they were not allowed to retreat or to allow themselves to be taken prisoners. And when they were forced on account of strong resistance, they were shot by their own officers.
So you mean to say that if they were taken prisoner through no fault of their own, if they fought very hard against the German forces and were still taken prisoner, that they were regarded as traitors to the Soviet Union?
They were more or less regarded as traitors, sure, that's for sure. It's only because the enormous number of prisoners we had in the first month after the beginning of the Russian campaign, nearly 4 million of them prisoners, you see. So naturally, I don't think that all of them were punished for that later on. But in principle, they were not allowed to. They were not allowed to be taken prisoner by the enemy.
You say that not all the 4 million POWs, Soviet POWs who fell into the hands of Germans and who were subsequently shipped back to the Soviet Union were murdered. But do you have any first-hand information in general about the fate of these Soviet POWs when they were returned to communist Russia?
Not of those Russian prisoners, but there were others who had been fighting on our side, volunteered for the same reason, like Ukrainians, for instance. And when they were in British and American captivity, and they felt that they were on the safe side now, of course they had no intention to go back to the Soviet Union, and they were forcibly handed over to the Russians by the scores of millions. Nearly 2 million.
At the end of the war.
At the end of the war. And this is some of these incidents I saw myself, and by the time I found myself in a POW case in northern France. I was separated in different compounds, and the neighboring compound was full of these unfortunate Ukrainian soldiers, Poles and whatever they were. And one day the whole camp was surrounded by American tanks and all that, and they were all dragged away. They were screaming and shouting and begging, but it didn't help, wasn't any good for them. They were shipped up and they were handed over to the Russians.
The Allies handed them over.
Yeah. So I believe that a similar fate some of the a lot of these on their own sort of must have suffered a similar fate. Maybe certainly not all, but quite a number of them, I think, have suffered a similar fate when they returned after captivity in Germany.
The Germans have been accused of killing not only 6 million Jews, but being responsible for 20 million Soviet dead as a result of attacking the Soviet Union. On the other hand, you seem to be implying that a significant percentage of those casualties were actually caused by Soviet policies themselves, a policy of no retreat, a policy of execution by their own officers.
Oh, sure. That's quite obvious. It's quite obvious.
So had there been a different military policy on the part of Stalin, the casualty rate of the Soviet troops would have been significantly lower. Do you believe that?
That is for sure. That is sure. And that's quite obvious. Oh, yes, of course.
Well, picking up the thread now, as you moved in retreat from the east to the west, how did you find yourself fighting at Arnhem in France? How did you come to?
I was wounded in that area, and I was sent back to my garrison.
You were wounded in the Ukraine or in Poland?
In the Poland.
How were you wounded?
I had a wait a minute. I had no, wait a minute. What? How can I describe it? I wasn't. No, wait a minute. I made a mistake now. I was shell shocked. I was shell shocked. I can't say wounded, but from the shell shock, I was deaf, completely deaf on both ears. See, so I was considered wounded, and they took me back to the hospital to the garrison where I came from in Brits, Germany. Stayed there for a while, and then had my annual leave, and from that place I was sent to the west. So we started out from there.
How long did your annual leave last?
About 2 weeks.
What did you do on your leave, on this little holiday that you had? Was that very precious to you, or?
Oh yes, I was going back to my Dortmund to see my parents after a long time.
Had they been harmed by any Allied bombing, or was there?
Not at that time, but later on, the idea. When I was already in captivity, my parents lost 2 houses in Dortmund in February 1945, shortly before the end of the war.
They owned 2 houses that were destroyed? Were they wealthy people?
Completely destroyed, yeah.
Were they wealthy people?
No, not too wealthy. My father had a coffee house, they call it a coffee house, and he was a confectioner by trade,
Candy maker?
Candy maker, you can say so. In American would say maybe candy maker, but we say conditor, that is actually a profession,
Were you able to obtain, when you took this holiday for 2 weeks, some good candies while you were on this?
I beg your pardon?
Were you able to have some of your father's confections with you?
Oh, yes, sure. I brought some of them along to my cameras too. So anyway, we, instead of being moved back to the Eastern Front, probably on account of my years and all, we were sent to I was sent to the West instead, and they had quickly formed an infantry battalion, and it was originally intended to send us to the so-called West Wall, to the frontiers in the west of Europe. To work and to be stationed in one of these shelter bunkers there,
To repel the D-Day invasion?
To repel the D-Day invasion, see. But, so we were moved to that area. I was the number 4 company, machine gun company, with 160 strong, and only less than 2 weeks later, we were 16 of us left. So the
16 out of a company of 160 in a week's time?
In less than 2 weeks' time.
What happened?
The casualties on the Belgian front and the Albert Canal were absolutely terrific.
How did these occur?
Yeah, there had been strong reinforcements especially from the Americans. fresh unit that had come over from the States. And if you want me to relate one particular incident that happened in that area, during this period, we were trapped in a small strip of land, narrow strip of land between the river Maas, and the Albert Canal. So we were waiting, and we were ordered to dug in to somehow get under cover and dug holes and to get some protection. And while we were doing that, the Americans had crossed the river with 2 pontoon bridges. And the next thing you know, they were there. And there was only one option, no other option but try to get away. And then we were in front of the river where I just came over, and I saved myself, and then I saved my life by swimming over the river. That was the only way to get out. But I saw, looking back, while swimming back and looking back from the other side of the river, that all of them, all my comrades that were left on that strip of land, who were either too tired or they couldn't swim or were wounded, they were all of them shot, murdered by the Americans. All of them.
By the American forces?
By the American forces.
But you did say 16 survived out of the 160 originally, is that
yeah,
correct?
for my outfit. Yeah, but all in all. You know,
but all the ones that were left on the bank.
I'm talking about these particular unit. There were not only ours, but some others too. You know, there are, to my estimation, 500 to 600 people on that strip. Between they were trapped within on that strip of land, and the Americans would have been they could have taken them prisoner, all of them, but they didn't. I saw with my own eyes that they shot at everybody there. One of my company was only one of the youngest, he may be 17 years, may have been 17 at the time. He was leaning against a tree, and he was badly wounded from his leg, and he had his arms up, and he was crying. But that didn't prevent him from being mowed down with his 10 gun from the American soldiers. So none of them were of these 600 was, I think, was left alive, that's for sure.
These were 600 men who were massacred before your very eyes?
On that strip of land, yeah.
By the American troops?
By the American troops, yeah.
Were you then, what date was this, what time period was this, 1944?
Yeah, that was 1944, just before we moved, these stragglers of us, as I said, from my own outfit, from that company, there was 16 left, and there were some other stragglers from other outfits, so we were 50 or 60 again, and then we were, all of a sudden, we found ourselves in the Arnhem area, and we were re-equipped, and our uniforms were rather ragged and torn apart and all that. So we received news, and I found myself a member of Waffen SS, you know.
But this massacre occurred in what month?
Yeah,
in what month did this massacre
occur?
That
was in, it could have been May, early June, something like that.
Of 1944?
1944.
And it occurred where?
On the Albert Canal in Belgium, not too far away from the Dutch border.
Can you say how many kilometers, roughly, approximately?
Maybe 30, 40 kilometers away from the Dutch border, on the Albert Canal.
And at this time you then went from service with the Wehrmacht to service with the Waffen SS?
Yeah, that's right.
And then what was your combat experience with the Waffen SS subsequently to that? It was at Arnhem, is that correct?
It was in Arnhem. We were to reinforce a rear party. Actually, the 2 units, they were the 9th and the 6th Panzer SS divisions. They already had moved away, and we were informed that they were on their way to the east again for some obscure reason. I can say that in retrospect, I don't know. But that's what we were told anyway. There were only 2 smaller rear parties of both divisions left in that area. I couldn't tell you exactly how many there were, you know, I have no idea, but not too many anyway. So we were there to reinforce them, and then this landing occurred.
the
The
Allied landing. American landing?
American, Polish, and British. The first wave that came down, if I remember, were Poles, then British and Americans.
And then what happened?
And it was all about that bridge across the river, the Arnhem Bridge, which was that was a fight. The fight was mainly over that bridge.
And so they came in parachutes?
They came in parachutes, yeah.
And you had held the town? You were holding the town at that time,
We were
Arnhem?
holding the town, yeah. And so when they came over, there was more or less fighting from house to house, and in the city of Arnhem. So we had prisoners and wounded in the basement from both sides. And if I remember, the Americans were very, very much afraid. They were scared. They were so scared that they thought that the end of their lives had come. And they were quite surprised that they were treated just like anybody else. They were treated, the wounded were attended to, and we even shared the last cigarette with them and chocolate, whatever you had.
Did you win the Battle of Arnhem?
More or less, you can say that was the last major victory of the German army, the Battle of Arnhem. Yeah, you can say that, yeah.
And then things did not go well for you because soon you would be captured. Is that correct?
Yes, but I still managed to get away from the Arnhem area, and I even got across the border into Germany. So we were, of course, we go into position there again with whatever we had. But only every second of us was still armed with a rifle. Not even everybody had a rifle anymore. So we had rifles and machine guns, and above all these Panzerfaust.
Which is what?
Which is the Americans, I think the Americans would call it the bazooka. These things which we were very efficient against tanks. But we have to go pretty near the tank, to apply it. But when that thing hit the tank, it was finished.
And where were you sent then?
And then, so that was in that area already in Germany. And then one morning, of course, we were overrun by the Americans. And,
at where? What location?
At a place called Heisberg. It's I would say about 50 kilometers north of the city of Aachen.
And this was in October of 1944?
In October 1944. Aachen had already been captured by that time. I think Aachen was captured in August in that year. So Aachen was already in American hands. So the Americans shipped us from that area right through Belgium to Paris. We spent a few days in a stable there in Versailles near Paris, and from there we were moved to Normandy, to the coast. And the Americans, when we were loaded on these boxcar trains, they distributed what they call these K rations or C rations, these small packs. They just flung them in the area there, so for everybody who was quick enough to catch them, they maybe get one or two of these, and others didn't get anything. But they said it's not so bad. Don't worry. In 4 hours' time you will be at a destination where you fed again. So we were not too worried about it. But actually, these transfers to the coast took more than 4 days. And we were already undernourished. Some of them were already undernourished, and they were bad, and some of them were actually dead before they even arrived at the destination.
What did they die from?
From starvation, under the treatment. That's for sure. Because on the way, the Americans couldn't care less. They really couldn't care less whether they fed or not. It was absolutely immaterial to that. In fact, during one of these long stays in the middle of that way to to the coast. The trains were being shunted around. That's what it took in all possible directions. You know, that's why it took so long. And during one of these long stays there, I remember that the Americans would come around with their steel helmet, and they had collected from the trees these tiny, what we call wild apples. They were absolutely unfit for human consumption, actually, you know. They had collected them, and they were distributing these things to the prisoners in lieu of wedding rings and watches and whatever one or the other still had in his possession.
In other words, they had to trade, the German POWs had to trade their jewelry for these apples?
That's right.
What were the American troops eating at this time?
Oh, everything. They had the big slices of corned beef, and they were eating that right in front of our eyes. It was just to show us how they were the masters by that time.
How would you describe your treatment at a POW camp? You were then sent to a formal POW camp, weren't you, in France?
Yeah. In this camp at Cherbourg, that was the name of the harbor town, it was a huge, I would call it a transit camp. There were, when we arrived, there were no accommodation whatsoever, no shacks, nothing, but just mud. The mud about knee high. We had to stand in there 3 days and more, you know. No accommodation whatsoever. It was raining and cold, you know.
No latrines, no shelter of any kind?
Absolutely
no
nothing.
Bathroom facilities or washing facilities?
And that's it. I wonder if I should even mention that. It's so ugly, you know, but if you want me to mention it, I do it. The toilet facility, the lavatory facility, consisted of dugouts, even level with the ground. Level with the ground, maybe 1 yard deep, and maybe 4 meters square, or 6 meters, or 10 meters square, and and there were the ground, I said, was very slippery and muddy, and they had to sit on the edge of this dugout, you know. So some of them, they were so weak, and so they probably fell in. They fell in just for sheer weakness. And then they would come with their cameras and photographers for their Stars and Stripes paper.
As the German soldiers fell into their own waste from weakness, then the American troops photographed
them. They really enjoyed it. They came with their cameras, you know, and probably for their papers, I don't know, for publication.
And how long were you a POW for the duration of the war then? You were never able to escape?
Yeah, so fortunately, it didn't take me it wasn't too long, but all in all, maybe roughly 4 weeks I was in Cherbourg camp, and from there we were shipped to Great Britain.
How do you describe your treatment at Cherbourg camp?
Well, as I said,
is Cherbourg
in Cherbourg
is the place that you're describing as having no facilities?
Later on, yes. Later on, they had put up some shacks there. You know?
See.
But not in the other. They went to some, but these shacks were so overcrowded that we had to lay on the ground, and we were packed in there like sardines, so closely that when one or the other had to turn around it, as you normally do in your sleep, the whole lot had to turn around. There was not enough room to move in that.
Was there disease? Was there hunger at this time?
There was dysentery and things like that broke out. And that accounts for the fact that some of my cameras there really looked like walking skeletons, including myself. My arms here, if you have seen them at the time, the 2 bones, the arms, that was all clearly visible. I was practically reduced to a skeleton by that time.
Then you were shipped to England, and where were you shipped, and how was your treatment there?
We were shipped to the south of England. We camped another large transit camp, about 6,000 prisoners in there or more, in the area of the Wasif in southern England, not in the area of Bristol. And that's where I stayed to the end of the war. And that camp was absolutely horrible too. The food was just a little bit too much to die, but not enough to live on. It was just a bare existence. You know? So we stayed there through the end of the war, and then they moved us back to Scotland. and from then on it was all right. I can say, generally speaking, the treatment in those camps depended on the attitude of the commanding officer himself. If he was a German beta, then give us a hard time. If he wasn't, then it was all right.
If a commandant was prejudiced against Germans or held bigoted feelings of hatred towards you, then of course it went much
Then
worse.
his soldiers would act the same way. And I can also have other examples. For instance, when they camp far away in the north of Scotland, you can't get any further north, it was entirely different. The commanding officer of that camp, his name was Lieutenant Colonel Murray. He was from the Black Watch, and he had been taken prisoner himself on the island of Crete in 1940, I think, or 41, when the island of Crete was conquered by the Germans. And he was the one that handed the island over to the Germans. And he was 4 years in a German prison camp. He was looking for strict military order and discipline, and that was all he demanded. But otherwise he was, I can't say it without a word of lie, he was like a father to us. He was really very good. So naturally he had no problems whatsoever. There was these detention barracks, for anybody that, but that was never occupied. Anybody was ever had to be punished.
Did the Scottish commandant who had been imprisoned by the Germans on Crete relate to you what sort of treatment he received, presumably?
Oh yes, he was always spoken in very high, he probably held the Germans in very high esteem on the basis of his own experience. Oh yeah, and he said, I was treated fairly, so it's my duty to do the same to you.
Once the war ended, were you then sent back home to be returned to your family and start your life over again and trying to rebuild Germany?
No, I stayed in England for, as I said, for more than 3.5 years. I was sent back in 1948.
You were kept in prison for 3.5 years?
For 3.5 years.
Was this due to the fact that you were a member of the Waffen SS?
Not at all, no, nothing to do with that, no.
Why were you imprisoned an extra 3 years?
Well, that was, I don't know, maybe in violation of the Geneva Convention. I don't know.
They never gave you justification?
No, not at all. In fact, I must even had occasions when large numbers of new arrivals came from the United States and Canada, and especially from the United States. They all of a sudden came to landed in our camp, and they told us that in the United States they had been officially repatriated. They were being told, now you are on the way to back home and all that. The press, everything was there, and maybe there was something wrong with the compass of the boat, because they didn't land in Germany, they landed in Scotland and stayed there for another 2.5 years. Yeah.
And yet there was never a reason given, never a trial?
No,
nothing.
not at all, not at all.
And then on a whim you were released in 1948?
When?
On a whim. I mean, in other words, just at their own initiative they decided to release you.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
The Waffen SS has been labeled by the Allied governments as a criminal organization, the implication being that every member of the Waffen SS is a war criminal.
That's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous.
Why?
Well, it's just Allied propaganda. It's just war propaganda, that's all. And it's understandable. I mean, war propaganda has its effect during the war, sure, and I don't even blame them for doing so, but it's about time, 40 years after the war, to come out with the truth and to say that it wasn't so.
It has been said that the Waffen SS, along with the Hitler government, exterminated 6 million Jews in the various camps. Do you believe that?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Why not?
Just imagine, it only takes a little bit of logic to know that it was absolutely impossible. When I was in British captivity, once in a while, we used to be interrogated by people that came, especially from London, And the idea was to re-educate us and to make good Democrats out of us, you know. So they interrogated us and asked us all sorts of questions and so on. And they, of course, they accused us of having known all that. It's impossible that you shouldn't know. And sometimes we were beaten right there and then, you know, when we said we had not the slightest inclination, not the slightest idea about these things. They showed us films of concentration camps which were, to us, absolutely unbelievable. So I said, what they asked her, what do you see about that? I said, I can't see anything about it because I had never heard of it. But these interrogators seem to be of the opinion that the whole German nation must have known it, and they were right from their point of view, because if such a thing had actually happened, it would be impossible to conceal it from the whole of the German nation. It would have been absolutely impossible. And that is my line of thinking why it couldn't have happened, not in the way it is related today.
So the films that they were showing you, which they claim to be films of people who had died as a result of poison gas chamber extermination, how do you explain the piles of bodies? Was this due to disease, or these pictures, these atrocity photographs of dead people? How do you account for the scenes of death and destruction that met the Allies when they went to Dachau and Belsen and so forth?
Yeah, at the time I couldn't account for these photos, but there were some of my comrades who recognized special areas. I remember clearly one film which was about Dachau, Buchenwald and other camps. And there was, I remember seeing a big pile of bodies that were burned in open on the street. And there were, the fellow next to me here recognized exactly from the silhouette that this photo was not taken at where they claimed it was taken. It was in the city of Dresden. And as we all know today, Dresden was bombed in February 1945, and in about 3 hours, 250,000 people were killed in that area.
Civilians or soldiers?
Civilians. So the local authorities they were absolutely unable to cope with the situation. They couldn't bury them, they couldn't cremate them all, so they actually were compelled to build these pyres in the middle of the street.
The local German authorities were compelled to do this to the corpses of the Germans, which the Allies had bombed Dresden. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay.
It was a structure of rails, and then the bodies were piled and they were burned. And these were shown in that film. So somebody said aloud, "That is Dresden," and then he was taken out by the military police. I don't know what they did with him. He was taken out of the audience, you know. And in other words, anybody denying such a thing in the interrogations again, when we were interrogated, then it could have meant very harsh treatment, you see. So naturally, I couldn't confirm it. I didn't see. All I said, I don't know about it. And if that, I used to say, invariably, used to say to the interrogator, if these things really did happen, I would be the last person in the world to approve of it. If you can prove it that it's right, then all I could do at the time.
But some of these pictures then, which were, the attribution was bodies, piles of bodies of Jews and freethinkers and Jehovah's Witnesses and others who had died in the concentration camps. Some of them were actually bodies of Germans who had been killed by Allied bombers at Dresden.
That is very possible. I'm quite sure that, yes, that is so, yeah.
Now, you're a citizen...
But as I said, I was at that time, I wasn't involved myself. I was not in Dachau myself, so I can't relate these things from my own personal experience.
You're a citizen of West Germany today, is that correct?
That's right.
What could happen to you for speaking out in the way that you have here today if you made this videotape in West Germany and it was broadcast? Would anything happen to you, or would you be all right?
No, I think it would not be. I could relate my experience on the Russian front, that's for sure, because millions of come experience similar things, and also others have stories to say about treatment in American and French prisoner of war camps. You see, so nobody could say anything about it. But I'm sure the time hasn't come yet in Germany to speak out in the open to deny these so-called atrocities in the German concentration camp, because that is a well-established fact, and even by courts, even the German courts are holding that these are well-established facts, and everybody who casts doubts on it, he can either be a fool or a Nazi or whatever, and so that you can really get into trouble there.
Can you briefly relate to me, because of a certain factor that we're dealing with, can you briefly relate to me what occurred recently to one of your SS comrades? Earlier you had told me that he in some way attempted to defy the ban on discussion of the so-called Holocaust, and he has been tried and convicted. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is right. He was a member of the Viking division, which, as is well known today, included an enormous percentage of non-Germans, and they were mostly fighting in the east, in the front line, in the Eastern Front. He had been an officer. He's about he's 3 years older than he was, 63 now, and he was brave enough to publish a small brochure with bearing the title "There Were No Gas Chambers," and it was nothing but a translation of an article which had been written in France by Dr. Fourisson, and so we felt it would interest a number of people. It was translated, and he published it, and he was taken to court, and it took about quite a few years with all these different instances, so from the local court and the higher court and the highest court, and about 6 weeks ago the final judgment was passed, and that was 18 months prison without probation for publishing this book.
For publishing this book. And he is currently appealing the conviction, is that correct?
He has appealed, but the appeal was rejected. So he's sitting at his home, and he may be taken to prison any day now. Actually, because it was an intervention of a powerful agency in Berlin to revoke this probation. The former sentence had been also 18 months and so on, but on probation. In other words, that they give you a chance for 4 years. If you stay out of trouble, then you are free. And by this probation, this part of probation was revoked on special instruction by those people in Berlin.
Mr. Vanderheide, if you had to do it all over again, would you?
What do you mean by all over?
If you had to, if knowing what you know now, and you were in Germany and you were called up for the armed forces, would you have served, and are you proud of your service on behalf of the Hitler regime at that time?
Oh, yes. Oh, sure.
Thank you for joining me today.
Okay.